Jackson Cole glanced over the control panel, hands moving with practiced ease as he adjusted a series of levers and dials. The faint hum of the small survey ship's engines filled the cockpit, a steady rhythm that usually put him at ease. But today something was off. The instruments flickered, the onboard AI stammered out error messages, and the readings from the planetary surface didn't add up. "Joe, I'm not liking these numbers," Jackson said, tapping at the console. Joe Markham, his survey partner and fellow pilot, stood behind him, arms crossed and eyes narrowed. Markham had the grizzled look of someone who'd spent decades hopping from one alien world to another. His sharp, no-nonsense demeanor had made them a good team. Jackson was the tech wizard, while Markham was the practical muscle. "Yeah, they're all over the place," Markham replied. He leaned over Jackson's shoulder, pointing to a series of red alerts flashing on the screen. "Gravitational distortion? That's not supposed to happen here." "No, it's not." Jackson swiped through the readouts, frowning. "We're well outside the zone of any known anomalies. And that last scan showed nothing significant. Something's not right." "Well, don't just sit there, genius," Markham grunted. "Adjust the stabilizers. We don't want to end up as a smear on some rock." Jackson was already on it. His fingers danced over the controls, but as soon as he recalibrated one system, another error popped up. The ship's AI chimed in, voice crackling. "Warning, gravitational flux detected. Recommending immediate altitude adjustment." "Yeah, no kidding," Jackson muttered. "Markham, see if you can stabilize the forward thrusters manually. I'll handle the autopilot." Markham nodded and headed to the maintenance panel. "You think it's just a glitch?" he asked as he pried open a panel and began toggling switches. "No, I think—" Jackson stopped as the ship lurched violently. Alarms blared, and the cockpit lights flickered before plunging them into a dim emergency glow. "What the hell was that?" Markham shouted, bracing himself against the wall. "Something just pulled us," Jackson said, his voice tense. He wrestled with the controls. "We're caught in some kind of gravity well. I'm trying to—" Before he could finish, the ship shuddered again, harder this time. The hum of the engines turned into a strained whine, and the AI's voice cut through the noise. "Emergency descent imminent. Brace for impact." "Markham, hold on," Jackson yelled as he threw the ship into a controlled dive. The planet's surface rushed up to meet them, a swirl of green and blue that offered no clear landing spot. Markham held onto the railings as the ship rattled like a tin can, and Jackson's hands worked frantically at the controls. "Can't you slow us down?" Markham shouted. "I'm trying," Jackson snapped, sweat dripping from his brow. "The thrusters aren't responding. Then we'd better find somewhere to land fast." Markham pointed to a clearing near a rocky outcropping. "There. Aim for that." Jackson gritted his teeth and yanked the control stick, sending the ship toward the clearing. The ground raced closer, and the ship's hull groaned under the strain. Just before impact, he managed to deploy what was left of the landing gear, and the ship hit the ground with a bone-rattling thud. Metal screeched, sparks flew, and the two men were thrown against their restraints. For a moment, there was only the sound of their own heavy breathing. The alarms had gone silent, replaced by the distant calls of alien creatures outside the cracked viewport. Markham was the first to speak. "You alive, kid?" Jackson groaned, unclasping his harness. "Barely. You?" "Yeah. Just wish I hadn't skipped breakfast," Markham grumbled. He struggled to his feet and surveyed the damage. "Looks like we're stuck here for a while." Jackson ran a diagnostic on the remaining systems. "Looks like we've lost all long-range comms. The NAV computer's fried. We're not going anywhere." "Great," Markham muttered. He peered out the viewport at the dense, unfamiliar jungle beyond. "Well, I don't know what the hell pulled us down here, but I can tell you this. I'm not dying on some uncharted rock." "Agreed," Jackson said. He stood, shaking off the adrenaline, and grabbed a portable scanner. "First things first. Let's see if we can find anything salvageable from the ship. Maybe we can figure out what hit us." Markham nodded. "Let's move." He hefted a toolkit and followed Jackson toward the hatch. They stepped out into the humid, alien air, their boots crunching against the rocky ground. Strange sounds echoed from the forest, and the sky was a pale green, the sun barely visible through the thick haze. "So," Jackson said, trying to lighten the mood, "you ever been stranded on a hostile planet before?" "Kid, I've been stranded more times than I care to remember," Markham said. "But this one feels different. Something's out there. I can feel it." Jackson glanced at him. "What kind of something?" "Don't know," Markham admitted. "But it's not just the wildlife. I think we're not alone here." "Well then," Jackson said, gripping his scanner tightly, "I guess we'll find out soon enough." Chapter 2. The Cold Welcome. Jackson stood stiffly in the center of the alien hall, his arms secured behind his back by an energy restraint that tingled faintly against his wrists. On either side of him, Solinari guards stood like statues, their tall, spindly frames clad in shimmering armor that reflected the cold, white light above. The chamber was vast, lined with pillars that pulsed faintly with a bluish glow, and a raised dais at the far end held a cluster of Solinari officials. Their elongated faces, framed by flowing silver hair, regarded him with expressions that ranged from wary curiosity to outright disdain. Markham, similarly bound, stood beside him. His scowl deepened as the silence stretched. "Sure feels like we're being weighed and measured here," he muttered, his voice low. "They've probably never seen anything like us," Jackson replied, keeping his voice equally soft. "They've got eyes and ears, don't they?" Markham said with a jerk of his chin toward the nearest official. "We're not circus animals. Maybe they could start with hello." A female Solinari stepped forward, her robes a deep shade of blue that set her apart from the others. She carried a slim, metallic device in her hands, her long, graceful fingers gliding over its surface as if she were reading something only she could see. When she spoke, her voice was musical but clipped, as if she had little patience for the occasion. "I am Lyra, overseer of the Council of Inquiry. You are humans, correct?" Her large, almond-shaped eyes shifted between them. "That's right," Jackson answered, trying to keep his tone calm. "I'm Jackson Cole, and this is Joe Markham." "Lyra, huh?" Markham piped up, managing a crooked grin. "Good to meet you. Now, how about getting these restraints off? They're starting to pinch." Lyra's expression didn't change. "You are unknown entities who have trespassed in our territory. The restraints remain until we determine you are not a threat." "Not a threat?" "Lady, we crash-landed here. We're not exactly armed to the teeth," Markham said, shifting his weight. "The only reason we're standing here is because your guards were faster than we were. Not like we put up a fight." "You evaded the first patrol," Lyra countered, her gaze sharpening. "You could have fled deeper into our lands. Yet you allowed yourselves to be captured." "Allowed?" Markham said, a disbelieving chuckle slipping out. "I tripped and fell in the mud. That's not strategy, that's bad luck." Lyra turned to Jackson. "And you? Do you have a reason for not resisting?" "We're not here to cause trouble," Jackson said, keeping his voice even. "Our ship was pulled down by something on this planet. We didn't come here on purpose. All we want is a chance to fix our equipment and go home." She stared at him for a long moment, then turned to the council members seated on the dais. They murmured among themselves, their language flowing like water, rapid and melodic. Jackson couldn't make out what they were saying, but their gestures, pointing, waving, occasional glances his way, didn't exactly inspire confidence. "I don't like this," Markham muttered under his breath. "They're acting like we've got a bomb in our pocket." "Just stay calm," Jackson said, though his own nerves were fraying. Lyra turned back to them, her device humming softly. "We will allow you temporary quarters while we review the data from your ship's remains." She gestured to the guards. "Remove their restraints and escort them to the holding chamber." The guards moved swiftly, releasing Jackson and Markham's bonds. Markham flexed his arms and muttered about time. "Don't get too comfortable," Lyra said. "You are not free to roam. Any attempt to leave the chamber will be met with force." "Noted," Jackson said, trying to keep his tone respectful. As they were led out of the council chamber, Markham leaned closer to Jackson. "What's the plan now, genius?" "Wait," Jackson replied. "See what they find out from the ship. Then maybe we can negotiate some kind of deal. They don't seem interested in killing us outright, so that's something." "Yeah, but I don't trust any of this," Markham said. "The way she looked at us, like we're pests they need to get rid of." "Let's hope we can change their minds," Jackson said. "Right now, we need them more than they need us." They stepped into a small, bare room that was clearly designed more for confinement than comfort. A single bench ran along one wall and a translucent partition separated them from the corridor. The guards stood outside, their glowing spears held upright. Markham sank onto the bench with a heavy sigh. Well, this is cozy. Jackson sat down beside him, scanning the walls for anything that might give them a clue about their captor's technology. It's not much, but it's better than a cell. Let's just hope Lyra's willing to listen. She doesn't strike me as the listening type, Markham grumbled. Maybe not, Jackson said. But we've got to start somewhere. Chapter 3, The Growing Bond. The morning light filtered through the pale, shimmering glass of the Solinari laboratory, casting an almost ethereal glow on the rows of alien flora suspended in tanks. Lyra stood at one of the workstations, her long, delicate fingers tapping quickly on a transparent console. She barely acknowledged Jackson and Markham's arrival, though she had requested their presence. Jackson cleared his throat. You wanted to see us? Lyra glanced up briefly, then returned to her work. Your ability to repair the hydroelectric stabilizer was noted. I require assistance in a field survey today. You and Markham will accompany me. Happy to help, Jackson said, eager to escape the confines of their assigned quarters. Not like we have much choice, Markham muttered, leaning closer to Jackson. But hey, beats staring at the same four walls. Lyra turned to them, her sharp features unreadable. There is a reason I have chosen you. Your technology is crude. Yet it functions in ways ours does not. This intrigues me. If we encounter any issues in the field, I expect you to explain your methods. Sure, Jackson said, feeling a flicker of pride. I'll try my best. Markham snorted. You sure you want to take the genius here on a nature hike? He's more comfortable with wires and circuits than anything out there. Your sarcasm is noted, Lyra replied dryly. Nevertheless, you will come. They set out an hour later, the three of them traveling on foot through a lush, green expanse of alien forest. The air was dense with unfamiliar scents, and the trees loomed high, their broad, iridescent leaves rustling faintly. The terrain was uneven, the ground covered in a thick layer of moss-like growth that made every step feel springy. So, Markham began, trying to make conversation. What exactly are we looking for out here? Samples, Lyra replied. Plant and soil specimens that may help stabilize our planetary agriculture. The ecosystem is delicate. We need solutions to improve growth and sustain our population. Sounds important, Jackson said. He glanced around, scanning for anything that looked out of place. What kind of problems are you dealing with? Lyra hesitated, as if weighing whether to share. Our resources have diminished. Over-reliance on certain technologies has weakened the natural environment. I intend to study Earth methods, as your world remains biologically diverse despite human interference. Markham raised an eyebrow. That's one way of putting it. Jackson stepped closer to a plant with bright, bulbous flowers and pulled out a portable scanner. This is what you're looking for? Lyra nodded, her focus on a similar specimen. Yes, collect samples from this area. I will document the surrounding conditions. Jackson knelt, cutting a small piece of the plant and placing it in a sterile container. He glanced at Lyra, who was making notes on her handheld device. So, do you do this kind of thing often? Field research is not my primary responsibility, she said without looking up. But it has become necessary. You don't sound thrilled about it, Markham noted. Lyra's expression remained neutral. I prefer controlled environments. The field introduces too many variables. Guess you and Jackson have that in common, Markham said, smirking. Jackson sighed. You really can't resist, can you? Nope, Markham replied, still grinning. Lyra finally looked at Jackson, tilting her head slightly. Your technology lacks elegance, but it is effective. I am curious about the thought process behind your designs. Is your species always so inventive in the face of limitations? Jackson shrugged. We make do with what we have. Sometimes that means finding solutions that aren't perfect but get the job done. Lyra regarded him for a moment, then turned her attention back to her work. A pragmatic approach. Interesting. The trio continued deeper into the forest, pausing at intervals to collect more samples and record data. Despite Lyra's reserved demeanor, Jackson noticed subtle changes. Her tone became less formal, her comments more frequent. She even asked Markham a question about his experiences on other worlds, though his answer, An exaggerated tale of a man-eating plant he'd encountered earned him a skeptical look. As the sun began to set, casting the forest in golden hues, the group reached a small clearing. Lyra motioned for them to stop. "We will camp here for the night. The return journey is too long, and travel after dark is dangerous." "Camping, huh?" Markham said, dropping his pack with a grunt. "Guess I'll start gathering firewood." "Firewood," Lyra repeated, her brow furrowing. "Why would you set fire to the local vegetation?" "Just an expression," Jackson said quickly. "He means we'll find fuel for light and warmth." "Unnecessary," Lyra said, activating a portable heat lamp. "Our equipment suffices." Markham shrugged and plopped down on a patch of moss. "Fair enough. Less work for me." As night fell, they gathered around the heat lamp, its soft glow illuminating their faces. Markham leaned back against his pack, arms crossed. "You know, this ain't half bad. Feels like an old field mission. Just missing the usual mess hall food." Lyra looked at him, puzzled. "Your species associates outdoor survival with communal dining?" "Something like that," Markham said, smirking. "Jackson, back me up here." Jackson chuckled. "It's a thing, yeah. We like to eat and talk around a campfire. Builds camaraderie." Lyra considered this, her gaze lingering on Jackson. "Perhaps there is something to be learned from your simpler methods. It seems to strengthen bonds among your people." "Yeah, well," Markham said, shifting to get more comfortable. "You spend enough time relying on each other out here, you tend to get close. Ain't that right, Jackson?" Jackson met Lyra's eyes briefly before looking away. "Yeah, I guess so." Chapter 4, Common Ground. The trail leading out of the forest was uneven, strewn with tangled roots and patches of spongy moss. Jackson focused on keeping his balance as he followed Lyra's swift pace, her slender frame cutting gracefully through the thick foliage. Markham trailed behind, grumbling as he swatted at buzzing insect-like creatures that seemed determined to treat him as a moving buffet. "Sure you know where you're going?" Markham called up, his voice laced with irritation. "Feels like we've been walking in circles." Lyra glanced back, her expression calm but firm. "I am quite familiar with this region. Your sense of direction may be lacking, but mine is not." "Lacking?" Markham said, raising a brow. "I've navigated asteroid fields with one engine offline. I think I can handle a hike." "I would not classify this as a mere hike," Lyra replied. "We are gathering essential data and observing ecological patterns. Your presence here is not for navigation, but for assistance." Markham rolled his eyes. "Got it. I'm just here to carry the gear." "You can carry mine too, if it's such a problem," Jackson quipped, trying to keep the peace. "Funny," Markham muttered, shouldering his pack higher. "Real funny, Jackson." As they continued, the forest began to open up into a rolling plain dotted with strange, crystalline formations. The light shifted, the sun's rays refracting through the crystals and casting shimmering patterns on the ground. Jackson stopped for a moment, marveling at the effect. "Beautiful," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra paused, turning her head slightly. "You find this pleasing?" "Yeah," Jackson said, taking a step closer to one of the formations. "Back on Earth, we don't see anything quite like this. The way the light bends and scatters. It's mesmerizing." Lyra watched him for a moment before speaking. "It is a common sight for us, though I admit I have not taken much time to appreciate it." Her gaze lingered on the crystal's glow. "Perhaps your perspective offers value." "Wow," Markham said, smirking. She just admitted humans have something to offer. "You hear that, Jackson?" "Don't make it a thing," Jackson said quickly, though he couldn't help but smile. He turned to Lyra. "If we're going to collect samples, is this the spot?" "Yes," Lyra said. "The soil here interacts uniquely with the crystal structures. It may provide insights into nutrient cycles. Begin collecting near the base of that larger cluster." Jackson set to work, digging carefully around the roots of a crystal cluster and filling sample containers. Markham grumbled but helped out, occasionally muttering about how much simpler it would be to just blast a chunk off with a laser. "Why do it the hard way?" Markham asked after a few minutes. Why not just take a core sample and call it a day? Lyra gave him a level look. Crude methods often damage the very data we seek. Precision is necessary. Precision is time-consuming, Markham muttered, though he continued to dig. But fine, your planet, your rules. Jackson chuckled. Markham, I think that's the first time I've heard you admit someone else's rules make sense. Don't push it, Markham said, tossing another handful of soil into the container. As the sun sank lower, casting longer shadows, they took a brief break. Lyra sat on a smooth stone, reviewing her data on a handheld device, while Jackson and Markham leaned. Why people? My work ensures our survival. Markham raised a brow. You don't ever take a day off? No downtime? What do you do for fun? Lyra hesitated, clearly unused to the question. I do not often consider such matters. My duties are my focus. Markham shook his head. Man, you need a hobby. Jackson here can teach you how to tinker with old tech, build something out of scrap. That's his idea of fun. I doubt your definition of fun aligns with mine, Lyra said, her tone neutral but tinged with curiosity. What do you consider enjoyable, Jackson? Jackson glanced up from his canteen, surprised to be brought into the conversation. Me? I like figuring out how things work. Fixing something that's broken. And sometimes, building something new from whatever I can find. I guess I just like seeing a problem and finding a way to solve it. That is a productive form of leisure, Lyra said, tilting her head slightly. It reflects your species' resourceful nature. Markham snorted. He calls it leisure. I call it tinkering until he finally breaks something for good. Jackson shrugged. It's all part of the process. They packed up their samples and began the journey back, the conversation meandering as they walked. Markham kept the tone light, cracking jokes and telling tall tales about past adventures. Lyra mostly listened, though her occasional questions and comments showed she was paying closer attention than she let on. Jackson found himself stealing glances at her, wondering what she made of their odd trio. As night fell, they reached a small outpost where they could rest. Lyra busied herself with her equipment, but for the first time she didn't seem entirely detached. Her responses were a touch more natural, her posture a bit more relaxed. Jackson exchanged a look with Markham, who raised an eyebrow and muttered, I think she's warming up to us. Maybe, Jackson said quietly. Let's not mess it up. Chapter 5, Trust in the Unknown. The outpost's dim lights flickered against the early morning haze. Jackson ran his hand along the rough stone walls as he made his way toward the central chamber. He had barely slept, too many questions churned through his mind after the previous day's events. As he entered, the faint hum of machinery filled the air, along with the faint murmur of voices. He spotted Lyra at a workstation, flanked by Markham, who was gesturing animatedly. Look, I'm telling you, it's not just random luck, Markham said. You're dealing with a system that. Lyra held up a hand. Your theories are appreciated, Markham, but we have protocols. Protocols don't mean much when you're knee-deep in a problem, Markham shot back. Sometimes you have to improvise. Improvisation often leads to instability, Lyra replied, her tone crisp. Precision and forethought yield reliable outcomes. Jackson stepped in before the debate could escalate. Morning. What's going on? Markham has been providing unorthodox suggestions, Lyra said, her voice tinged with mild annoyance. We are examining the samples collected yesterday. I would prefer if he focused on assisting rather than proposing theories. I'm just saying, Markham began, but Jackson cut him off. Why don't we see what the data shows first? Jackson offered. Then we can figure out what to do next. Markham grunted, folding his arms. Fine. I'll keep my brilliant insights to myself. Lyra turned back to her console. The soil analysis is nearly complete. Once we identify the composition, we can determine the next steps. Jackson joined her, watching as intricate graphs and symbols flickered across the screen. Anything interesting so far? Lyra glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. There are traces of an element we have not seen in significant quantities before. It may be a factor in the ecosystem's current instability. Further study is required. Well, that's something, Jackson said, leaning closer. Maybe this could help stabilize your crops. Perhaps, Lyra said, her voice softening. If we can isolate the element and understand its effects, it may lead to more effective solutions. Markham tapped a nearby table. Or you could just try the direct approach, plant something new and see if it works. Lyra shot him a look. Experimentation without proper preparation risks further harm. Not every problem needs a 20-step plan, Markham muttered. Sometimes you just try, and if it doesn't work, you try something else. Jackson stepped in again. How about this? We let the analysis finish, then we try a controlled test. Best of both worlds. Sound fair? Lyra considered his words, then nodded. That would be acceptable. Markham smirked. See? Compromise? Not so bad, is it? Ignoring him, Lyra focused on the data again. There is one more sample I wish to examine. It is located in a remote area, but it may hold the key to understanding the full picture. Sounds like another field trip, Jackson said. Indeed, Lyra replied. However, this location is more challenging to access. I will require both of you to assist. Markham leaned back, grinning. Great. I love a good hike. You'll love it less when you see the terrain, Lyra said dryly. Prepare your equipment. We leave shortly. The trek began just after midday. The path was rugged, the incline steep, and the air thinner than Jackson had expected. Lyra led the way with practiced precision, her movements deliberate and efficient. Jackson and Markham followed close behind, their packs heavier this time with additional equipment. Sure you know where you're going? Markham asked, his tone light but with an edge of doubt. Yes, Lyra said without looking back. I have traveled this route before. Jackson glanced at Markham. She seems pretty confident. Markham shrugged. I'll believe it when we get there without breaking an ankle. As they climbed higher, the view expanded. The vast landscape stretched out below, crystalline formations sparkling in the distance, and strange, bird-like creatures glided overhead. Jackson paused to take it all in. Never thought I'd see anything like this, he said quietly. Lyra turned, her expression softer than usual. The environment here is unique. Many of my people take it for granted. Your perspective is different. Markham chimed in, breaking the moment. If by different, you mean constantly amazed by shiny things, then yeah, that's Jackson in a nutshell. Jackson sighed. Thanks, Markham. Really adds to the conversation. Markham grinned. Any time, buddy. They continued upward until they reached a plateau where jagged rocks jutted out like the teeth of some ancient creature. Lyra stopped, motioning for them to halt. The sample site is ahead. Proceed carefully. Jackson followed her lead, scanning the terrain. What exactly are we looking for? A specific type of crystal, Lyra explained. It emits a faint energy signature. I believe it may be connected to the element found in the soil samples. Markham snorted. Great. More glowing rocks. Because the last batch was so easy to carry. Lyra ignored him, pointing to a cluster of stones near a narrow crevice. There. That is what we need. Jackson knelt down, carefully extracting a piece of the crystal while Markham stood guard. The process took longer than expected, and by the time they were done, the sun was beginning to dip behind the distant peaks. We should return before nightfall, Lyra said. As they made their way back down, the conversation turned lighter. Markham shared a few stories from his earlier expeditions, some of them clearly exaggerated, while Jackson and Lyra exchanged thoughts on the potential uses of the samples. By the time they reached the outpost, the tension that had lingered between them was notably diminished. For the first time, it felt as though they were working together, rather than just tolerating one another. As they unpacked their gear, Lyra glanced at Jackson and Markham. Your assistance today was appreciated. Markham grinned. Was that a compliment? Somebody mark the calendar. Jackson chuckled. We'll take what we can get. Chapter 6. The Forbidden Connection. It was late when Jackson finally set down his tools. The workshop's faint hum had long faded into background noise as he worked to piece together a small portable generator, cobbled from what few usable parts he'd found. The Solinari didn't seem to trust him with access to their more advanced equipment, which left him improvising, something he'd gotten good at. He leaned back, wiping his hands on his shirt, and glanced over at Markham, who was seated across the room, meticulously cleaning one of their salvaged instruments. Anything good on your end? Jackson asked, rubbing the tension from his neck. Markham looked up, smirking. Found a screw that doesn't fit and a wrench that's bent. So yeah, things are looking fantastic. Jackson chuckled, his shoulders relaxing a bit. Well, it's not the worst setup we've had. No, Markham admitted. But it's a long way from the best. He set down the instrument and leaned back, balancing his chair on two legs. You've got that look again. What look? Jackson said, raising a brow. The one that says you're thinking too hard. Trying to fix everything yourself, Markham said. So, what's eating at you? Jackson sighed and gestured toward the generator. If we can get this running, we might have something to bargain with. A sign that we're more useful than they think. Maybe, Markham said, lowering his chair back to the floor. But that's not what's really on your mind, is it? Before Jackson could respond, the door slid open, and Lyra stepped inside, her presence immediately shifting the room's atmosphere. She carried a slim data pad, her expression calm but thoughtful as her gaze swept over the half-assembled generator and the scattered tools. I see you have been busy. Just trying to make myself useful, Jackson said, straightening up. What brings you here? Lyra walked closer, holding up the data pad. I have reviewed the latest analysis of our samples. There are promising results, but I require clarification on one point. Markham got to his feet, stretching. Sounds like you two have it under control. I'm gonna grab some air. He left without waiting for a response, leaving Jackson and Lyra alone in the workshop. Jackson felt a faint twinge of tension as the door hissed shut behind Markham. What's the question? Jackson asked, gesturing toward her datapad. Lyra glanced at the screen. The composition of one of the soil samples shows signs of an unusual reaction when combined with certain compounds. I have not encountered this before. Is it a common occurrence on Earth? Jackson leaned over to take a closer look. It depends. Sometimes soil interacts with certain chemicals in unexpected ways, especially if the environment's been disturbed. You might be seeing something like that. Lyra tilted her head, considering his words. Interesting. Your approach is more intuitive than our own methods. Well, Jackson said, shrugging. I'm no scientist, but I've seen enough weird results in the field to know sometimes you just have to follow where the data leads. Lyra nodded slowly. Your perspective has value, despite the simplicity of your technology. Thanks, Jackson said, trying not to read too much into her tone. I think. Lyra set the data pad down on the workbench and stepped closer. Her movements were graceful yet deliberate, her voice softer when she spoke again. I have also noticed that your contributions have changed certain opinions among my people. Good opinions or bad? Jackson asked cautiously. Some are still resistant, Lyra said, her large, luminous eyes meeting his. But others see potential in your resourcefulness. They view you as less of a threat and more as an individual with unique insights. I'm glad to hear that, Jackson said. He hesitated for a moment, then added, and what about you? What do you think? Lyra's expression was difficult to read, but there was a hint of something more than her usual detached professionalism. I believe there is merit in collaboration, and perhaps a measure of trust. Her words hung in the air, and Jackson felt a subtle shift between them. It wasn't just about the data or the generator or even their current situation. There was something unspoken and understanding that had been building over the past few weeks. Lyra glanced away for a moment as if weighing her next words carefully. When she looked back at him, her gaze was steady. You have demonstrated qualities I did not expect from your species. Jackson smiled faintly. You mean we're not as reckless as you thought? There is still recklessness, Lyra said, the corner of her mouth twitching upward. But also creativity, persistence, a willingness to adapt. High praise, Jackson said lightly, though his chest tightened at her tone. From what I've seen, your people are pretty remarkable, too. It's just different. Different can be valuable, Lyra said quietly. For the first time, her hand brushed against his as she reached for the datapad. The contact was brief, but it lingered in the air between them, unspoken but not unnoticed. Jackson didn't pull away. Instead, he looked into her eyes and said, I think we're starting to understand each other. Lyra's voice softened even further. Yes, I believe we are. Chapter 7, The Turning Point. The conference room was quiet except for the faint hum of alien machinery. Jackson and Markham stood side by side, facing the assembled Solinari Council. The leaders sat in a semicircle, their elongated, luminescent faces showing a mixture of skepticism and interest. In the center of the room, a holographic display projected data from the recent soil experiments. This element you discovered, one of the counselors said, her voice even but firm. You claim it can be used to stabilize our agricultural output? Jackson stepped forward. I'm not claiming it on my own. The data speaks for itself. He pointed at the holographic graph. The soil sample from the high plains, when combined with the techniques Lyra and I developed, yielded increased growth rates without damaging the environment. This isn't a guess, it's what the numbers show. Numbers can be manipulated, another counselor interjected, leaning forward. How do we know your human methods aren't a dangerous gamble? Lyra, who had remained silent until now, rose from her seat. Her movements were deliberate, her tone measured. We have verified the results. Multiple tests confirm that integrating human approaches with our own can achieve stability. It is not recklessness. It is innovation. Markham folded his arms, smirking slightly. And let's not forget who put in the legwork. We didn't exactly sit around twiddling our thumbs while this data fell from the sky. Another counselor frowned. And yet, the decision to act on this information is not one we can take lightly. Jackson took a deep breath. I understand your caution. But think about what's at stake. Your food supply is under threat. We're offering you a solution. A way to preserve what you have and even improve it. The council murmured among themselves, their alien language flowing quickly between them. Lyra remained standing, her gaze steady on the counselors. Markham leaned closer to Jackson, muttering under his breath, I don't think they're buying it. Jackson kept his voice low. We have to convince them. They need to see that we're not just outsiders. We're partners. As the discussion grew more animated, one of the counselors raised her hand, silencing the others. She turned to Lyra. You have spent the most time with these humans. Do you believe their methods can truly benefit us? Lyra hesitated for only a moment before replying. I believe their approach is unorthodox, but it has shown results that we cannot ignore. I have seen firsthand how their adaptability can lead to success. The counselor nodded slowly. Very well. We will consider your findings. The meeting ended without a definitive answer, but Jackson could sense the tide beginning to turn. As the counselors filed out, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Markham clapped him on the shoulder. Not bad, kid. I think you might have actually gotten through to them. Let's hope so, Jackson said, glancing at Lyra. What do you think? She looked at him with an expression that was almost hopeful. It is a step forward. But their decision will not come easily. Nothing worth having ever does, Jackson said. Markham raised an eyebrow. Now you're sounding like an optimist. Maybe I'm starting to see things differently, Jackson replied, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. Lyra stepped closer, her voice quieter. Your efforts today were commendable. Regardless of their decision, you have shown them that cooperation is possible. Jackson met her gaze. I couldn't have done it without you. For a moment, the tension of the past weeks seemed to lift. The three of them stood together in the empty conference room. No longer just a crash-landed surveyor, a skeptical alien, and a grizzled partner. They were something more, something that might finally make a difference. Chapter 8. A New Future. The decision came faster than anyone expected. Within a day of the council's meeting, Lyra informed Jackson and Markham that the Solinari leaders had agreed to a trial implementation of the techniques they developed together. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was a start. A chance to prove that working alongside humans could bring results. You think this means they're starting to trust us? Jackson asked Lyra as they walked through the research complex. Perhaps, Lyra replied, her tone cautious. But trust is not earned so quickly. It is more likely they are intrigued by the results. The leadership will be watching closely. If we fail, it could solidify their doubts. Nothing like a little pressure, Markham quipped, stepping up beside them. I'd say we're used to it by now, though. Right, Jackson? Jackson managed a small smile. Yeah, if this works, it could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for. The three of them headed to the field site where the initial test would take place. The location was carefully chosen. A small, controlled area on the outskirts of the Solinari city, where any potential side effects would be contained. As they arrived, teams of Solinari scientists and technicians were already setting up monitoring equipment and securing the perimeter. I don't see any balloons or champagne, Markham said, surveying the scene. No one else excited about this? Lyra gave him a sidelong glance. Excitement is not the appropriate response. This is a critical moment. Hey, excitement can be appropriate, Markham replied. Sometimes you've got to celebrate the little wins. Jackson chuckled. One step at a time. Let's get this set up first. They spent hours preparing the site. Lyra directed the Solinari team while Jackson and Markham adjusted equipment and calibrated the systems. It was meticulous work, but by the time the sun began to set, everything was in place. As darkness fell, the field was illuminated by a series of glowing pylons arranged in a precise pattern. Jackson stood back, surveying the setup with a mix of anticipation and nervousness. Ready to flip the switch? Markham asked. Ready as we'll ever be, Jackson said, then glanced at Lyra. Consoles. On the main screen, graphs and charts updated in real time, showing subtle changes in the soil's chemical composition. So far, so good, Jackson said, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Markham leaned in closer to the screen. And no explosions. Always a plus. Over the next several days, the tests continued. The early results were promising. The plants in the test field showed improved growth, and the soil remained stable. Lyra worked tirelessly to analyze the data, while Jackson and Markham handled adjustments and repairs as needed. By the end of the trial period, the council reconvened to review the findings. This time, when Jackson and Lyra presented the results, the response was noticeably different. The counselors still asked pointed questions, but there was a shift in their tone. A cautious curiosity replacing the initial hostility. You have demonstrated that this approach can yield positive outcomes, one counselor said. But further testing will be required before we consider broader implementation. Fair enough, Jackson said, glancing at Lyra. We're happy to continue working with your team. This is just the beginning. After the meeting, the three of them stood outside the council chamber. Markham clapped Jackson on the back. You know, for a couple of crash-landed nobodies, we've done all right. Don't get too comfortable, Lyra said, though her expression was softer than usual. There is still much to prove. Sure, Markham said, smirking, but at least we're moving in the right direction. As they walked back to their quarters, Jackson found himself looking at the Solinari city in a new light. The towering spires, the softly glowing walkways, the strange but beautiful architecture. It no longer felt alien. It felt like a place where he could make a difference. This was a good day, he said quietly. Lyra turned to him, her eyes meeting his. It was a step forward, and you played a significant role. Jackson smiled. So did you. We wouldn't have gotten here without you. Markham groaned. All right, enough mutual admiration. Let's grab something to eat. I'm starving. As they laughed and headed back inside, Jackson felt a small but genuine sense of progress. Their journey wasn't over, but they had shown that cooperation and understanding, however tentative, could lead to something better. And that was a start.